Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to have here Professor Stephanie Rivera Berruz to present today's session. Professor Berruz is an associate professor at Marquette University. Her research is interdisciplinary and explores historiography, social identity, and current political issues that link power, history, identity, and the environment. She has published and co-edited an anthology, Comparative Studies in Asian and Latin American Philosophies. She's currently working on a monograph titled On the Border of Belonging. Luisa Capetillo, Ofelia Rodriguiez Acosta, and Evangelina Rodriguez Peroso. She explores latter Caribbean women from Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, who wrote about the role of women in political life in the turn of the 20th century in the Hispanophone Caribbean. So it's my pleasure, and please, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Pedro. Thanks so much for having me. All right, so as the bio noted, this is part of a book project. This will be the third chapter of the book where I've been doing some historical work on figures from the Hispanophone Caribbean, and really interested in centering them as philosophical voices as well as giving some kind of historical depth. So what you're going to get here is a little bit of what's happening with the work on Ofelia. And then in the broader project, you'll get that in conversation with the two other female figures, one from Puerto Rico, one from Cuba, and one from the Dominican Republic. So, all right. So you can go ahead and switch the slide to the first one. So Ofelia Rodriguiez Acosta, born in 1902, died in 1975, was born in Pinal del Rio, which is the westernmost province of Cuba, in the city of Artemisa. So if you can see it on the map, it's to the west of La Habana, a place of birth that would seem to predict the values she would embody. She articulated an independent life and was economically sustained by her writing. She never married. She was one of the most productive Cuban women writers of her time. And yet to date, we have scant personal details of her life. We know she was the daughter of a magistrate. She was a sister who was also a writer. She had a sister who was also a writer. And we know nothing about her mother. However, she was notoriously prolific. Her first book, Evocaciones, was authored when she was 12, and an ardent feminist activist through the length of her life. The record of Rodriguez Acosta is really traced in her diction and the memory of her actions. She wrote 7 novels, 1 book of stories, a series of chronicles and essays, and 1 play. Most importantly, for the purposes of what I'm doing here, she was a very prolific journalist and contributed to some of the largest circulating magazines in Cuba during her time, Bohemia, Carteles, Social, Grafos, as well as local newspapers, Diario de Marina, and El Mundo. She also founded her own magazine, Espartana. It was founded in 1927. Her activism can be traced also in an ardent stance that she actively was very public about in Bohemia in 1930, as well as her participation in labor unions for women in El Club Femenino de Cuba as a librarian, that she held that position from 1923 to 1928. Pardon my dogs in the background. Rodriguez Acosta passed in 1975, although her place of death remains unclear, as some accounts indicate that she died in La Habana and others indicate that she died in Mexico City. Oral accounts of her biographers locate the possibility of her death in Mexico City, as she resided there after 1940. However, her death certificate and her obituary locate her in Cuba at the time of her death. And regardless of location, what remains consistent in the biographical accounts is that she died in a mental health institution. Despite the scant biographical record, Rodriguez Acosta had great relevance in the years spanning 1920 and 1940, which were central to the formation of Cuban national imaginary. She was a public intellectual figure, although she remains somewhat forgotten as a figure in the post-revolutionary Cuban narrative. She lived out her ideals in an unwelcoming world, and she was a clear example of what we now would term a militant feminist to the best of her capacities at the time. She held radical positions on free love in the face of Catholic social doctrine that understood love as a social problem, and I'll return to that point at the end. She ardently argued that the subordination of women was the result of social norms that restricted women's liberty and not the result of biological inadequacy. She defended the need for women's economic independence grounded in freedom of education. She was a socialist feminist that consistently saw the role of labor and equity and the construction of social oppression and the way it cut across women's lives in the creation of dependency on men through the social conventions of marriage. Finally, she actively resisted the Machado dictatorship, the Geraldo Machado dictatorship, which ran from 1925 to 1933, through her defense of student activism and the construction of in a notion of hacer patria, making motherland, as a future-facing project for which we must care for in the present. And as will become clear, her radical interventions on gender and politics visioned a future for human social progress with a unique and equitable role for women in the construction of modernity. She was, as Madeleine Camara writes, obedient to the demands of modernity, yet rebellious in the face of its ineffectiveness for rethinking femininity. So modernity makes landfall in the Caribbean in a kaleidoscope of ways, engendering contradictions from the underside of its possibilities. It is colonization of the Caribbean that makes modernity possible. For a figure like Rodriguez Acosta, modernity was a participatory horizon key to social progress and historical transformation. Belonging in modernity was necessary, but as it stood from the moment she was writing, had to be deeply reformed given its exclusionary and inequitable formation. She ardently advocated for avenues that place women central to the human unfolding of social progress. Woman had a unique role to play in the unfolding of modernity because of her creative capacities. She was, as I will argue, concerned with problems that have to do with social reproduction of nations, seen in her ardent commitment to a nationalist project of social progress, heavily informed by currents of naturalism. Here, naturalism was understood as a current of thought that sought to break from the theocentric conceptions of the world, specifically Catholicism, that relied on the development of science for explanatory power. So in her work, we witness contradictions between what it means for women to participate in a national project and at the same time a call to disavow norms by which said national project was originally constituted. Following the work of Lorgia Garcia Peña, I do not understand the presence of contradictions as a weakness, but rather a description of a tension that must be held in order to navigate the advent of modernity alongside her desires for norm disruption. In this context, gender shows up as a problem of both woman and man, albeit for different reasons. And in the end, Rodriguez Acosta advocates a perspective that challenged the very definition of woman that would, by extension, also redefine man. She grounds that redefinition in her search for the human as an equalizing agent. It is the human and its natural relation to life that participates and sets the stage for the type of social progress she's imagining. The human is at the same time defined by the project of modernity, ushered in by colonization in explicitly exclusionary ways, and certainly not a subject that women could hold. Nevertheless, for her, the nature of a human life was to be lived, studied, suffered, and most importantly, confronted. We can see the threads of naturalism showing up in this perspective on life, not as mandated by God, but rather as having its own mechanisms to which we are beholden. It's no surprise that one of her most famous novels would take on the title La Vida Manda, which loosely translates to Life Commands, as it brings to the fore the ways life naturally operates out of our control. And the best we can do, as Rodriguez Acosta would have it, is to face it, confront it, and live it the best we can, striving toward more equitable futures by reforming oppressive structures in the present. So in what follows, I'm going to trace a little bit of her political philosophy with an eye towards her formulations of gender freedom and social progress. I aim to show that in the tense intersection between her radical critiques of gender norms and her utopic visions of modernity and progress, we find deep and rife concern with problems around social reproduction. That is, the conditions that make life and all of its commands possible in the first place. And to do this, I focus heavily, although not exclusively, on her feminist writings from Bohemia, which circulated a weekly column in which she had a weekly column that circulated from 1930 to 1932. And I choose this because I find it as a really important place of public diction that was central to the formation of national belonging. I'm interested in Bohemia because it offers a window into a language and meaning of the historical moment in which Rodriguez Acosta is writing. It's a space that in one breath sustained hegemony by producing the narrative of nation. It was the largest circulating magazine at the time. It published approximately 30,000 copies weekly. So it was very formative in the national Cuban imaginary. And then at the same time, it contested the boundaries of belonging. I mean, they gave her a weekly column to write about these issues. So it's for that reason that I located here. I also just want to note that Bohemia has been digitized, and you can access the archives of Bohemia. The University of Florida has those digital archives, and they're free and open to access. And you can access them by issues, and you can also download them by PDFs if you want. All right. So from 1930 to 1932, Rodriguez Acosta launches a weekly column titled La Campaña Feminista, or the Feminist Campaign. In Bohemia. During this time, Rodriguez Acosta consolidates her voice as a public figure, which begins with her publication of La Vida Manda, the book, in 1929. The novel was greatly successful in provoking conversations about feminism and the situation of women in Cuba, particularly because of its crude way of presenting the situation of women. The main character, Gertrudis, experiments with free love, alternative sexualities, and motherhood without marriage. Yet she ends up self-destructing. The world was unfit for a life lived differently. In an interview with Berta A. Martinez Marquez, which is pictured on the left, published in Bohemia on April 20th, 1930, Rodriguez Acosta reflects on that self-destruction could be the route for any other woman who lived Gertrudis' life. She offers a reflection of the condition of women more broadly in Cuban society. Gertrudis as a character becomes a stand-in for the feminist values that Rodriguez Acosta holds, and yet in many ways does not see enacted in the world. The publication of La Vida Manda marks the beginning of the first era of Rodriguez Acosta's writing, which culminates in La Campaña Feminista. Through the establishment of voice, she sets the stage for her vision of a world that's been characterized through what another author has called the feminist decalogue, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So it's worth noting in brief that her second era of writing is marked by a trip to Europe shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War, as well as her move to Mexico in 1940, where the remainder of her works are published. The shift is marked by a move from realism to lyricism that takes up philosophical reflections on democracy and spiritual uplift rather than institutional reform. Although I contend that you can read some of the threads of her commitment to spiritual life in her earlier writings as well, but it becomes really, really explicit in her later writings. Okay, so Bohemia, and so pictured here on the left, right? This is the interview that I was talking about, but this is kind of what it looks like when you pull it from the archives. Was the largest circulating magazine at the time. By 1933, Bohemia was distributing 50,000 copies weekly. It was a magazine of great political influence and generative of national consciousness. For Bohemia, specifically, one of those moments was the resistance to the Machado dictatorship, which really culminates in 1933. And it's for this reason that I'm really drawn to the journalism that she's up to in Bohemia as a way of temporally tracing her writing, embodying her political commitments in a very public manner, a way of witnessing her writing as diction that resists oppressive structures and questions the normative values of nation building, essential to the project of modernity. And at the same time, it's a mechanism with which we can witness some of these contradictions that are endemic to these projects, since the nation is always built on exclusion. And in this way, I think we can read her commitments to reform as an individual matter, not necessarily a sweeping renovation dictated by law that can in one breath argue for utopic visions of sexual gendered norms, birth control on demand, voluntary paternity, the leveling of difference, and at the same time be constrained by the inequities of belonging that make modernity emerge as it does. And here I'm specifically thinking about social transformations of modernity that center the individual as self, contractual understandings of society, as well as the introduction of market-driven economies and bureaucratically administered nation states. And so this is the world that Rodriguez Acosta is living in. And the Machado regime is emblematic of this moment in Cuba, with the institutionalization of import substitution of light consumer goods, the creation of an island oasis for tourism that would funnel in theory to civic improvements, as well as extensive political graft funded by U.S. loans. The market crash of 1929 that frames the Great Depression in the United States subsequently reverberates in Cuba with a crash of the sugar industry as the U.S. shifts its consumption to domestic beet production at a time when it consumed approximately 75% of Cuba's sugar. So the market crash just completely pummels the economy in Cuba because of its relationship with the United States and the US consumption. The response by the Cuban people is met by the Machado regime with an unprecedented state repression that included the murder of middle-class journalists, students, and political activists. This moment then also frames Rodriguez Acosta's activism and understanding of nation as her feminism is explicitly anti-Machado and critical of U.S. imperialism, which is also important in understanding what it means to be modern at the time. And so she confronts this reality by drawing attention to the gap between the promises of modernity and its inequities, engendering all of these sorts of contradictions. So La Campaña Feminista consisted of a weekly publication on the topic of feminism and its multiplicity. The column was accompanied by a letter sent in by a woman reader in answer to two questions. The first one, what are the main shortcomings that have hindered women from a complete triumph in life and in the feminist cause? And the second one, what are the virtues and good qualities that woman possesses, but that remain inactive, stifling triumph? The responses to these questions then reveal a rife landscape of feminist thinking. The campaign itself ran for 4 months with this particular structure, from April to August. On August 17th, 1930, the campaign, quote unquote, draws to a close, but she continues to publish a weekly column on feminist themes until July 24th, 1932. In some, Rodriguez Acosta's columns tally up to about 78 entries. One interview with Gabriela Mistral, who's a very famous writer from Chile, feminist writer from Chile, and a short story titled La Construcción de un Hijo, the construction of a son. The theme of these essays, by and large, is the incorporation of feminism and values of equality into the reform of Cuban society. The essays share reformist tone with desire to educate, organize, and mobilize the feminine public in different moral values so as to better incorporate into national public life. Although it becomes clear as the essays unfold that Rodriguez Acosta understood new norms for women and men very differently than traditional Cuban society at the beginning of the 20th century. So I want to just, before I jump into the more nitty-gritty details of what I'm interested in, I want to give a little bit of framing of just how extensive her feminist political philosophy was. And Madeleine Camara, who is one of the premier scholars, the only one really, I'd say, on Ofelia Rodriguez Acosta, or was written most prolifically, has kind of titled this thing a feminist decalogue or 10 commandments according to Ofelia, to give readers a sense of what her commitments were, and then out of which I think we can deduce all sorts of things, and also understanding where she sits in relationship to feminist movements and politics in her time. So in the 2 generations that followed Cuba's independence from Spain, rights became a key part of Cuban political consciousness, largely informed by José Martí's political discourse of equality, liberty, and social justice. The years spanning 1902 to 1940 witnessed the proliferation of feminist organizations that sought to influence the direction of legislation in newly independent nation states. Hence, the thread between the ideals that guided Cuban Revolution and the feminist movement is quite felt, yielding a corpus of legislation that was by 1940 one of the most progressive in the world. Nevertheless, it's important to keep in mind that Cuban feminism emerges in a period that's also marked by political instability, where social militancy, political controversy, and revolutionary ideals served as the backdrop for feminist activism. And it's really unique because of its roots in national independence, as well as its confrontation with the U.S. hegemony, which are happening at the same time. And so this is part of what Rodriguez Acosta is drawing to. And it's important to also note that feminist leaders were largely privileged women with social and political advantages that allowed them to become central figures in the cause. And so they reflected a commitment to democracy as an ideal to effect change that would not necessarily displace men, but rather make space for women at national state levels. We see a commitment to the promise of progress as an unfolding in which Cuban women sought to belong. And so for Rodriguez Acosta, modernity was a horizon of moral transformation that required educating for the future. Belonging in modernity meant socially progressing with new moral codes of the times in a world where women would be educated without fear of knowing, without fear of acting, without fear of being reduced to debility, and with the security necessary to confront struggle. For as she saw it, the men of the future would not be like the men of the present either. And that's actually a quote from one of the entries in Bohemia from 1931. So Rodriguez Acosta sits in this feminist panorama as someone who held tightly to the relationship between activism and her intellectual work. She actually talks and names different types of feminist trends. One of them being a practical feminism that she calls it, and the other one she refers to as a salon feminism, right? One having to do with being on the ground and actually participating in political activism. And then the other one is what what we now contemporarily would term to more bourgeois feminism, right? One that is really just interested in talking and theorizing, but not doing, or at least this is the kind of distinction that she draws. So in many ways, like, I think what you get here is you get someone who is predating a lot of the terms that then become very central to feminist philosophy, feminist theory, in ways of characterizing different strands of feminist practices. And so to talk a little bit about her decalogue. So first, right, woman, thou shalt defend equality. So she was clear in her demand for equality, and was an equality that would be achieved specifically through economic liberation. Without economic stability, there was no freedom. So I think this is kind of what undergirds her whole project. She's really, really concerned about women's capacities to economically sustain themselves, first and foremost. And if that doesn't hold, then nothing else follows. Second, participating in political life. Women were to participate in political life as a mechanism of resistance to the corruption and despotism that had befallen Cuba, and specifically with men at the helm, right? So this is the way she characterizes it. She notes in an entry to Bohemia, as well as in La Vida Manda, the book, that political problems have little to do with women per se, but rather with men and a masculinity that is unprepared for women to enter into the political sphere. Suffrage, in this instance, right, which is something that's kind of circulating in the ether, is merely an instantiation of this problem of men unprepared to receive the vote of women, not of women incapable of voting, which is the way the problem had been characterized at the time. Cultivating moral superiority, anticipating what we now turn to be a feminism of difference. Rodriguez Acosta saw the difference between men and women often grounded in cultural production that yielded difference in the spiritual and maternal realms. She holds to the claim that the tragedy of woman is one of exploitation in a socially fabricated world for men. Or not submitting to marriage. And this is one that I think made her very standout for her times. So she was vehemently critical of the patriarchal family and the roles it pitted on women, specifically wife and mother. And so she argued that marriage was largely rooted in conventions, that divorce, because divorce had recently been introduced as legal, was demystifying. The prevalence of divorce itself, she argued, signaled the appropriate decline of marriage, which she wrote about in an entry to Bohemia called New Norms in 1930. She was a skeptic in many ways of the institution of marriage and the norms revolving around it that held marriage together. And so she becomes very critical of love itself. It's for this reason that she understood love as a social problem. And so this is where I'll turn to in the next section. But I think this is one of the most interesting places where we see her ideas come to life, as it sets the stage for how she's conceptualizing relations of belonging. Seeking pleasure, she was very, very committed to ensuring that women had sexual lives. And this really comes to life in her fiction. You see it in La Vida Manda, is a really good standout example, where erotic life is just part and parcel of natural life. So you see that the argumentative link to naturalism. And so it ought not to be only an enactment of masculinity. Thou alone shall not beget. So also not accepting the womanhood as a biological tragedy. She was also an advocate of control over reproductive measures, so much so that it landed her in the landscape of eugenics. So from her perspective, flavor of what we might call eugenics these days, but for her, it says it's the capacity for women to control their own reproductive fates, while men could be merely sperm donors, so to speak. And so in that the construction of a son that she publishes in Bohemia, which is a short story, it's basically the story of a young woman who finds a man and asks him to just be a sperm donor, right, in 1930. And this caused a lot of scandal when she published this. And she was just like, I don't understand. I mean, he's a naturally fit person that I could reproduce with, right? That was the kind of the overarching motivation for the story. But as we can see, right, part of what is happening here is that we're selecting for traits, right? And so what we now come to think about as movements in eugenics, right, she's thinking about and like, well, how could this be useful for women to control how they reproduce, right? So she's thinking about reproduction at the time, and certainly thinking about it in a way that nobody else was. defending children. So she was also really concerned with children born out of wedlock, because this was a debate that was happening at the time, and also really, really important for the state. The state was responding to children born out of wedlock. And so she really thought it was important to recognize children born out of wedlock, and as well as the support for single mothers. Not rejecting men. So she was not about confronting men or women or pitting the statuses against each other, but everything always hinged on a relationship to life. So there was a leaning on a humanism and a universalism at the same time. She wasn't interested in rejecting men as a categorical whole, and further saw her interrelated relations between genders with an eye towards justice. Not submitting to religion, extremely critical of institutionalized religion, everything from Buddhism to Catholicism. Actually, the first entry of Bohemia is a critique of religion, and she talks about Buddhism in it. So any institutionalization, condemning war. She's very opposed to war. And she also thought women had a very unique place in response to war conflicts. So this is the kind of landscape that we're working with. Like, so if you read the span of her work, these are all the commitments that kind of fall out, right? So her feminist position is grounded in the concept of gender as woman and man. So her feminism sees gender as a main axis around which subordination occurs, and then difference emerges along class, which is unsurprising given her reliance on Marx and Engels, as well as the figure by the name of Angelica Balabanov. I don't even know if I'm saying that right, in her entries. So she's citing these people. She has like a whole entry actually on Engels towards later on in Bohemia. So this also entailed a bit of negligence on race. So I just want to flag that. I don't want to not pay attention to the fact that race is in the mix, but she's not paying it to it. She's thinking about race in relationship to the human. So again, that universalizing move. And she wrote a piece called La Raza Humana, or the Human Race, that she published in 1932 that speaks to this. In which she notes that racial difference will merely be a historic episode that will be overcome by the human race. And so we witness the way in which she's firmly rooted in a universalism that's very largely indebted to Enlightenment thinkers, and structure how she's thinking about modernity in general. And it's this universal move that allows her to argue that feminism is not about woman's relation to man, but rather about confronting the realities and the struggles of life. Her consistent return to life and its demands and commands as a theme in her writing undergirds her commitments to a naturalism that in the end saw human life as having shared struggles. And so she speaks to this point in a few entries where she talks about, quote, and this is translated, the forces of the human spirit are propelled by pain, where it comes from the burning dynamism of private or public struggle. So pain and struggle, constant, all throughout her work, giving us a sense of living, right? So it's in the pain and in the struggle that we get a sense of what it means to be alive, affirms our responsibilities over our actions. And no other topic reflects this so clearly in her work than the topic of love, right? So for her, love, and she, in that interview that I talked about that was featured in an earlier slide, she talks about love as a social problem. She explains in this interview. And so she gives readers perspectives on the main character of the book, Gertrudis, in that interview, where life unfolds in the face of struggle and loss of love. So loss of partners, loss of family, loss of a child who only lived, like her child only lived a few months, a few hours after birth. Gertrudis, whose name is itself an homage to an earlier Cuban-born feminist, Gertrudis Gomez de Avellaneda, is the embodiment of the practical feminist ideals as she enacts a morality in a world unprepared for her choices. So the novel traces the rocky path as she attempts to embody the ideals of economic independence, sexual freedom, and an intellectual life, which result really tragically. In many respects, the struggle and tragedy that characterizes life is the corpus of Rodriguez Acosta's work, always confronting loss. And love really seems to be the hinge point here. And so as readers, we're witness to this development. And as the interview comes to a close, she notes that feminism is more than a change in a situation to a woman's life. Rather, it's accompanied by a change in consciousness born out of the demand for justice rooted in love, generosity, and humility. So love shows up again. So love conceptually connects gender, it connects sexuality, but it also connects to labor, right? It's mediated by gender norms that dictate what is acceptable or decent in intimate relations. It also flags a type of traced in the human experience and required for the conditions of the possibilities for life in general. We need loving relations, and to engender them is a type of labor, right? Although it need not be one that is enacted through exploitative structures, right? I want to suggest that it's always exploitative, but it is certainly labor, affective labor. And so in calling love a social problem, Rodriguez Acosta is opening a window into the sets of relations that structure intimacy on an individual level, as well as structural. Citizenship and national belonging more broadly require the policing of sexuality and gender to constitute the body politic. And that's kind of what's happening in the backdrop during the Machado dictatorship. And so to read love as a social problem interrupts the norms of both gender and sexuality, fundamental to the constitution of the post-colonial nation. And it draws attention to the conditions by which marriage also becomes a meaningful endeavor. Marriage is, in many capacities, a way through which to regulate the norms of love through the formation of contract. Rodriguez Acosta, staunchly critical of marriage, both because of its anti-clerical stance, but also because of a problem of economics and wealth transference. She argues that marriage is held in place by bourgeois norms that hold wealth and its transfer in place. In other words, marriage is an economic endeavor that holds the norms of intimacy, love specifically, in place, so much so that in the absence of economic stability, marriage and the norms of the family, specifically monogamy, so she also goes after monogamy, they just don't show up in the same manner. The question becomes how to enact new norms that equalize, while at the same time create conditions of economic stability. So as a social problem, Rodriguez Acosta notes that the norms of love are undergoing shifts at the hands of social progress. So in a piece that she calls The Woman of Today in Love, which is published on September 21st, 1930, she spells out what she takes to be a characteristic, what she spells out to be what she takes to be characteristic of the shift, which has to do with the place of love in women's lives, or rather the life available to women with respect to love. So she notes that women have historically had one of two options with respect to exploring love in their lives: marriage on the one hand or adultery on the other, both in the same way foiled by living by virtue of Catholic social norms that made marriage the only route to sexual freedom. Love, she argues, for women has forcibly occupied their whole lives, whereas for men it's merely an episode or an aspect of their lives. And so the shift, she notes, is found in the fact that women have available to them new norms that allows them to live more full lives where love is not the driving feature of how a life is constituted. The modern woman has come to understand that undergirding love is a legitimate claim to pleasure, which has at the same time made her sentimentally independent from man, which has also at the same time allowed her to make room for other interests. And here she lists a ton of interests, including leading intellectual lives. So in closing, love shows up here not as the defining feature of a life, and hence neither is marriage. And so she understands that the modern woman must open herself up to broader concerns of her times, which change the focus of all of her consciousness. The shift in the norms of love make it possible for us to see that women have a social responsibility much more important than fidelity to a man. Importantly, however, the responsibilities that Rodriguez Acosta is concerned with have to do with the progress of the nation. And so she just constantly notes participating in social progress and promoting of citizenship appropriate for national belonging. And yet at the same time, we also know that these are the processes of exclusion that lean on the normative unfolding of love to structure the regulation of the population. And so we can appreciate the tension through which Ofelia is moving, of a utopia not yet here and a present that's very unfit for love. So thank you.